One of the many rattles and clatters that the FZ09s and MT09s are known for is from the clutch. And the rattle that we're tackling this time has been dubbed the Gronk. As shown there, this noise is generally experienced during low engine RPM and during deceleration. A quick rundown on the list of tools that you're going to need to do all this is a 17mm socket, an oil filter socket or pliers, 5mm hex bit, flat screwdriver, 12mm wrench, a rubber hammer, 10mm socket, a 1 3/16 inch or 30mm socket, a breaker bar, and a torque wrench. So first off, let's drain the engine oil and swap out the oil filter in preparation. Then we'll pop off the clutch side engine cover and start checking things out. First off, we're going to remove the 3 bolts holding the plastic shield on using our 5mm hex bit and slide off the cover. Then we'll lift the clutch arm spring over the lug on the side cover to release the spring tension there. Go ahead and loosen the lower adjuster on the clutch cable. And now we need to bend this little tab up on the pivot to let us slide the cable out. And now we'll go ahead and remove the rest of the bolts holding on the clutch cover. Don't worry about sorting these because they are all the same length. We'll go ahead and move the O2 sensor harness out of the way to the right side. And now use our rubber mallet to help break the seal on the side cover and slide it off. Now's a good time to go ahead and check out the teeth on the shaft inside. Make sure everything's clean and greased, no teeth are missing, no chunks of metal, all that good stuff. The clutch pull rod shaft does have a lot of slack inside this bearing, but that is not the cause of the noise that we're after. And likewise, the little slack between the clutch plates and the basket is also not the culprit, but it will make a little bit of noise while you're checking things out. With the bike in 6th gear, I'm going to use the rear wheel to turn over the transmission and engine and check the basket. We're checking for any broken fingers on the clutch basket and just anything out of the ordinary. And that click I just heard is what we're looking for. The clutches and the basket are moving together. Do you see where the problem is? To make this easier to see, I've marked the clutch basket in line with one of the teeth on the driven gear. Now watch that alignment as I rotate the wheel again. And we got it. We'll go ahead and continue disassembly, and the clutch pressure plate bolts will be the next to come out. Using a 10mm socket, back the bolts out fairly evenly just to keep anything from binding up while you're removing it. Now we can remove the pressure plate for the slipper clutch. It does take a little bit of wiggling to unseat the rubber cushions in the plate and remove it from the clutch. Go ahead and check out these rubber pieces. They're an important part to the slipper clutch mechanism. We'll talk about that later. Now this bike only has about 7,700 miles on it, so I expect the clutches will be in good shape. We'll go ahead and check out the plates later also to make sure if we need to replace them while the bike is apart. Okay, now we need to unstake the nut on the clutch hub. I'll use a small flat bit that fits into the flats on the transmission shaft. And the nut's pretty soft material, so a few taps with a hammer should get the sleeve out of the keyways. With both stakes undone, we need to heat up the nut in order to soften the red thread locker on the inside. Now break this nut loose. You can leave your bike in gear and use the rear brake to hold everything still while you break it loose. And just a heads up, it is tight. We'll go ahead and back the nut off and check the threads for any damage after the nut's out of there. We got away clean and can reuse the nut on this one. Awesome. Go ahead and remove this cone washer so not to lose it. And slide the hub out. Next up, we'll remove the bolt holding the oil pump sprocket in place, also using our 10mm socket. Don't worry about any kind of timing marks on this. It just uses the flats on the inside of the gear to drive the pump. After that, we should be clear to slide the clutch basket and driven gear out so we can see the cause of our noise. Take care not to drop the bearing or sleeve inside of it. Go ahead and remove the oil pump chain. And behind this plate is where all the racket comes from. Now we're ready to see what causes the Gronk. I've already drilled the heads off of these rivets that hold the back plate on. And after removing that plate, you can see the cushions between the lugs on the basket and the driven gear. This small amount of slack is compounded by the weight of the bike compressing the rubber, letting it rotate back and forth during acceleration and deceleration. These cushions are also fairly well known to not only shrink, but also get a little bit harder as they absorb oil, and they get a few years of heat cycles on them. For example, this cushion should be a pretty tight fit inside the bores on the gear. Instead, it has just enough tension to hold itself in place. But one little poke will cause it to fall out of the gear. And you can also see where the gear has rubbed back and forth on the inside of the backing plate, and it's left the pattern of the gear face on the plate. There's a few ways to remedy this situation. You can order replacement cushions from Henson that are said to fit the MT09 basket. Their part number is CU216. And with those, you'd either have to drill out the rivets and thread the holes in the basket for bolts, or I think it would be possible to press these rivets out and maybe find an alternative way to fasten everything back together. Another option is you could just buy an aftermarket clutch assembly, but those tend to be pretty pricey. And then we come to the option that I'm going to use here, which is using a Yamaha factory driven gear assembly. The part number for the assembly was superseded in 2021 for the MT09, and hopefully that includes some better bushings. And before we start reassembling, I want to quickly explain the slipper clutch mechanism for these bikes while we're cleaning and reassembling everything. There are 3 rubber cushions that go inside of the pressure plate, and the ramps of the pressure plate will slide under the tangs on the clutch hub. So as torque is applied from the rear tire to the engine while decelerating, the pressure plate can rotate slightly and reduce the pressure on the clutch plates, which allows a little bit of slippage to occur instead of sliding the rear wheel. Likewise, when you get on the throttle and torque is applied from the engine to the rear wheel, the pressure plate can rotate the opposite direction and increase the pressure on the clutch plates, reducing the ability for the clutch to slip under throttle. These cushions go in place to dampen the action of the slipper clutch and also set the spacing between the pressure plate and the hub when everything is assembled. Because of that gap, the thickness of our clutch pack is pretty crucial to good operation. At the inside of our clutch pack is the judder spring and seat plate. These allow the clutch to engage smoother and keep the clutch from grabbing and juddering during engagement. These go together inside the assembly like this, and allows the cone-shaped plate to make contact with the steel clutch plate next to it when the pack is compressed. And there is a thinner friction plate that is made to fit over the judder spring that allows all this to happen. You also have 2 additional thin friction plates and a larger steel plate with dimples on it that will go to the outside of the clutch pack that work with the slipper action of the pressure plate. This plate has a larger inside diameter to fit the pressure plate and will not fit on the hub assembly, so it's kind of hard to mess that up. And to see if we need to replace any clutch plates in this pack, I'm going to measure the friction and steel plates to make sure they fall inside the spec. The tolerance for the friction plates is 0.115 to 0.121 inches with a minimum thickness of 0.111. And the steel plate should measure 0.087 inches to 0.094 for the outer plate and 0.075 inches to 0.083 for the others. And with each of the plates checking out in spec, it's time to measure the clutch pack all together. This measurement determines whether the slipper mechanism can work correctly when everything is installed. Ideally, this measurement is taken before the clutches are oiled, since the friction plates will absorb some oil, making them slightly thicker, and also you'll have the thickness of the oil coating on there. But since these plates have been in the motorcycle already, I'm going to look for the pack to measure at or above the top of the allowed tolerance, which is from 1.68 inches to 1.71 inches. And as I figured, we're just over the tolerance for dry clutch plates, and the clutch still operated perfectly in the motorcycle, and our only reason for the teardown is the noise that we're chasing. Next up, I'm going to measure the clutch springs to check their uncompressed length. These have a tolerance of 1.78 inches all the way down to 1.68 inches. Measuring these springs is a bit tricky since you don't want to actually compress them while you're measuring it. With just enough pressure to hold the spring in, we're at 1.759 inches. Again, 1.759. And the last spring is hanging on at 1.761. So again, we're well within tolerance to continue operating with these. And the last thing to inspect before we start assembling the clutch is the hub nut. On this, you just want to be sure the threads are in good shape, free and clear of any burrs or any junk that could cause problems installing, and no Loctite left behind. Ours came out nice and clear, so we're ready to go with the installation. And to start off the reassembly, we're going to get a good coating of engine oil on the inner sleeve and roller bearing, and the bore inside of the driven gear. Check the spacer and thrust washer for any noticeable wear. Go ahead and wipe these down with a fresh layer of engine oil. We'll slip the oil pump chain onto the driven gear. We'll go ahead and slide on that assembly with the bearing and the inner sleeve together onto the shaft. You'll need to rotate the gear a little bit while you slide it back on, just to get the teeth to mesh with the gear coming off the engine crank. Make sure it's seated all the way back. At this point, just double check the threads on your transmission shaft are clean and clear, no old thread locker left behind. Next up, we'll slide on the thrust washer that goes behind the clutch hub, and smear a fresh layer of engine oil on this guy when you install it. When you install the hub, you can oil it up a bit as well, it won't hurt anything. Next up is your flat washer, followed by the conical spring washer, which has a side labeled out. For the hub nut, they recommend using thread locker, and although I strongly believe that 90 foot-pounds of torque and staking the nut is enough to hold it, I am going to go ahead and use some blue thread locker just for less chance of damaging threads later if it needs removed. And there's no need to over apply the thread locker either. And to torque this nut, if you have a clutch holding tool, awesome. But you can leave the bike in gear and use the rear brake to tighten the nut back down just like we broke it loose. That transmission won't be hurt by 90 foot-pounds, believe that. We'll wipe off any excess thread locker, and it's time to stake the nut with a hammer. And I'll use a square driver for this. Next up, we'll slide the oil pump sprocket on. Remember, there's no timing on this, it just slides onto the flats of the oil pump shaft. And this bolt torques down to 11 foot-pounds. Now we'll slide on the judder spring like we talked about before, with the outer edge of the spring facing outward. Following that's going to be a thin friction disc. Next up will be a steel plate with the rounded edge of the teeth facing in toward the engine. On the thicker friction disc, they may be marked on one of the tabs. If they are, line them all up. I'm going to line these up using a cast arrow on the clutch basket. And after this steel plate will be one of our remaining thin friction discs. Go ahead and insert the clutch push rod into the pressure plate, along with the remaining friction and steel plate. The shop manual recommends a lithium grease on the rod, but as loose as it fits, the grease would be washed away by your next service interval anyway by oil, so I'm just going to put a thin coat of engine oil on it. Slide on the pressure plate and clock the tabs on the last friction disc one slot off from the rest of your clutch pack. We'll insert the rubber cushions back into the pressure plate. And next up is the clutch springs. When installing the outer pressure plate, the shoulders on the inside of the plate should locate inside of the springs. And run the bolts down evenly until they just start to get tight. Now torque these bolts down to 7.2 foot-pounds. On with our gasket. Unless your gasket's damaged, you can normally reuse these. Ours is sprayed with a layer of copper coat just to ensure that it seals off. One last time, we'll visually inspect the teeth on the clutch rod shaft to make sure that they're lubed. And when the clutch cover is installed, we want the clutch arm to be lined up with the arrow on the cover, pointing toward the dot on the lever. As you slide the cover on, angle the lever about 45 degrees away from the bike so it lines up with the teeth on the push rod. And with our cover on, we have good alignment. Now reinstall the spring over the lever and the tab on the cover. And reinstall the clutch cable into the arm. And we need to bend this tab back down. Now we can slide our cable back down into its bracket. Now I'm going to install the bolts into the clutch cover, but skip over this hole, and this hole for the plastic cover. These bolts torque to 8.7 foot-pounds. As you install the outer cover, this tab should hold your O2 sensor wires in place. When I set the cable, I like to leave a little bit of slack at the clutch arm, then use the adjuster at the lever up top to make the final adjustment on free play. We're ready to fill the engine with oil and do a short run of the engine to make sure oil is pumping and circulating. The anticipation is killing me. Beautiful. The oil level pulled down. And we have circulation. Now we'll make sure the oil level comes back up and top it off if needed. Yamaha has a recommended free play at the end of the clutch lever, but I prefer to start with a small gap at the perch. This gives a nice 2-finger pull and a nice point of engagement on the clutch. Done. And all that leaves is a test ride to ensure that ugly noise is gone on deceleration.